So every 10 years, the city has to recalibrate the districts to make sure that the populations are relatively equal. 2010, the city of Detroit had a population of this. In 2020, the city of Detroit had a population of this. So the numbers went down. Because of that, we've got to recalibrate what the districts look like and shape them in a way that, again, provides for relatively equal population in each district. Now, here's what's interesting. When you look on the east side of the city, you had a huge population loss. In District 4, as the furthest east that you can go, it was a 20% reduction in population. In District 3, which is right next door, there was a 16% reduction in population. And when you go all the way over to the west side, where we are, and well, let's move before we come to us. District 2, there was a 6% reduction loss, and then now in District 1, there was a 4% reduction loss. Now, when you start looking around, it doesn't look like we got that many people who left the city of Detroit. What that really could translate into is that we had fewer people who filled out the census from the previous 10 years. And there's a whole host of reasons why people don't fill out the census, and we know that's actual truth. And so that means that we've got to do a better job as a community of getting our folks more engaged in the census. We tried all kind of things. We had hip-hop artists. We had other entertainers who came out and said, hey, sign the census. We had giveaways that we had during that time as well. So we made some traction. We made some inroads, especially at that last push, but we've got to get that push on the front end. And we've got to make sure that we get those numbers, because as we see, it affects so much. Starts here with the federal. I mean, we lose money as a city as a result of the population loss. What we're seeing now is just another aspect of what that translates into. Joining us today to talk about the redistricting that's going to take place in the city of Detroit. City Council is charged with approving these districts in January. And that's when we will be providing what these districts are going to look like. We've got 5 maps that are before us right now. But those maps may change just a little bit based on the feedback that we get from colleagues. But what you're going to see are 5 maps that are present, that reflect the potential changes that have been presented thus far for District 1. And you'll see some for the rest of the city as well. But as you know, because our population has not shrank as much as some of the others, we're going to be losing some of our boundaries, some of the neighborhoods within our boundaries. Now, it can't be the west side, because on the west of us is Redford. It can't be the north of us, because on the north of us is Southfield. So it's either going to be on the eastern portion, the southern portion, or a combination of both. And that would be District 2 and District 7. So helping us kind of walk through how we got to this point, what is being considered as it relates to districts as we move forward, and also talk a little bit about the process. And I'm excited to see him here, because he wasn't doing as well this past week, but he was able to come out of bed. And he's also a District 1 resident as well, y'all, and that's probably why he's here. He got that D1 in his heart. We've got the Director of the City Planning Commission, Director Marcel Todd. Ladies and gentlemen, come on down. And joining him is none other than the city planner with the City Planning Commission, Ms. Timmery Sweat. I did it right. Yep, so I told you I've been practicing. And they're going to walk you through all the potential changes.
So what we would, again, like to do, as the councilman indicated, is just kind of walk you through what we've done and what the background information is behind this redistricting. Once the electorate of the city of Detroit decided in 2012 or in 2011 with the adoption of the current charter to actually go to electing council by districts, that this city would be subject to the changing of those districts in response to the change in the census. And again, as indicated by Council President Pro Tem, whatever those numbers actually are, and we are clearly underrepresented, we still legally have to respond to what the census numbers are for the city of Detroit. So the Home Rule City Act requires that those cities, those municipalities across this state that are elected by or have their legislative bodies elected by district, they must respond to the census and undergo this redistricting process. The legal underpinnings. This is where we get our guidance primarily from the law department and as well as the attorneys that are in City Council's Legislative Policy Division. First and foremost, the legal requirements, primary considerations are that we are as equal as possible in terms of our population from one district to the next, and that each of those districts is compact and contiguous. Then there are several other factors that are contributing factors that guide us to a lesser degree. They are not legally binding, but they are good practice and in many cases necessary. And Mr. Baxter spoke to some of those, so I will build upon the comments that he made in furthering the applicability of what he said to this process. Next slide, please. Those primary considerations, again, deal with the population. Our population has decreased, again, at least by virtue of what the census has achieved. It means that that average number that has to be achieved or around which we're looking to achieve for each of the 7 districts is 91,400. We can go, again, as far as 5% above or 5% below. That would be 86,830, I believe, and then 95,770. We'll get the numbers correct. Yes, thank you. So 95,970 is the highest of the range, and then the lowest of the range is 86,830. The next, again, is compact. Compact just means that it should be as tightly, as densely woven together. The most compact form for who are my mathematicians or folks who like geometry in high school. The circle is the most compact thing because every point from around that centroid is equidistant from it. A square would maybe be the next. So we're looking to make it as compact as possible. Contiguous simply means that it is connected, that it is not separated. When we talk about some of the, we'll use that term gerrymandering that we may have seen or questioned in recent years as we've seen redistricting done at the state or federal level, and you see these oddly shaped districts. We remember what happened to the 13th districts at some point, congressionally, such. Those things are still allowable within maybe the extremes of the law, but we're trying not to create those situations in the city of Detroit. So again, we're trying to be as simple as possible. With that said, however, next slide, the shape of the city does provide us with some challenges, if you will. It's an already oddly shaped city, and on top of that, we have 2 other cities within our boundaries, which cause us, again, to have something unique to respond to. With regard to some of the other factors, again, we look to hold and respect other political boundaries as much as possible. And also, we are, as an extension of federal law, we're not looking to divide any ethnic communities. So to the extent that there are core populations that have been established, the Bengali community, which we have in District 3 and adjacent to Hamtramck and Highland Park, or where we have a core Hispanic community in District 6. We are not looking by law to divide up such communities as those unless, of course, there are circumstances at those higher planes of legality that warrant it. Similarly, we're trying to hold as much of the existing districts and the communities inside together as we can as we go through this process. But chiefly, again, we have to respond to those issues of, again, equal in population as well as being compact and contiguous. That is what guides us primarily. Next slide. Go ahead. In 2012, when we first created districts, this is what we provided City Council in terms of their initial options, guided by the same principles that I just spoke to in terms of federal law. That first one in the upper right-hand corner was basically approached with by trying to orient districts horizontally or moving on an east-west axis, if you will, across the city. The next one in the lower left-hand corner, we tried to do the same thing, but approaching the districts going vertically or running north to south. That third slide is one that was a hybrid, if you will, mixing the two groupings together. The last slide was the thought of just creating clusters with a central cluster. Ultimately, City Council elected to go with that third one, and that is essentially the basis for the districts that we have today. There were some minor tweaks that were made in order to ensure that we were consistent in every detail with, to the extent possible, with the legal parameters. But this is essentially the concept that bore out the districts that we are in today. Next slide. All right, so again, here is what we have adopted today. And again, just to repeat what Mr. Tate said earlier, the numbers in the lower left-hand corner are apportioning the current census data to the existing districts. So you can see the disparity that we have now, and we'll highlight that further on the next slide. Here you can see the 2010 numbers applied to the current district configuration, and then you see the 2020 numbers. The 20 numbers you can see, again, the extent to which we've had population loss. As Mr. Tate indicated, again, districts 3 and 4 had the most, followed by 5 and 6, and then the greatest stability is right here in D1 and D2, and then to a lesser extent also in District 7. But as a result of that, it means that where the stability is, this is where you're going to have to draw from, unfortunately. Next slide. Also, Mr. Tate indicated the boundaries of the city, which have which create fixed boundaries and limit the extent to which you can actually make change. So again, we've got 8 Mile across the north, we've got the points over there to the east, Redford, and then Dearborn, Lincoln Park, et cetera, as you get to the south, and then and southwest, and then the river along the south. These essentially, of course, mean that you're only going to be able to work primarily within the city to make change. Again, you're going to have to go from one district to the next in order to begin to bring them into population. The next thing that is a limiting factor, and this goes back to what Mr. Baxter was presenting earlier, are the voting precincts. This grid that you can see within the outline of the city are your current 400 voting precincts. When we established the current districts in 2012, we were working with over 500 precincts, and which gave us a finer grain, if you will, more puzzle pieces to work with in order to actually piece this together. Now we are only working with 400. Next slide. This next slide shows the populations that have been apportioned to each and every one of those 400 precincts. Next slide. This slide is intended to illustrate what has happened in some 100 situations. As, again, Mr. Baxter indicated earlier, a number of these precincts have been consolidated, again, over the years since 2012 to now, and the latest consolidation taking us from 450 voting precincts down to 400. The blue shaded area is what what voting precinct 101 looked like in 2012. Adding the green shading to it is what it now looks like today. So that line between the green and the blue, which is Harper, is no longer available as a district boundary. In the current districts that we're under today, as approved in 2012, the boundary between District 4 and District 3 was Harper. That line is no longer available to us because of the fact that these two previously separate voting precincts have now been combined. And again, that happened over 100 times back in the spring when elections had to, also in response to operational concerns and the census, further shrink the number of voting precincts. Next slide. So again, that gives you the grid upon which we are building all of these options. What I want to do now is walk you through the district, well, walk you through all 5 options that we've provided City Council, but focus in on what in particular has happened with respect to District 1 with Ms. Wedd's assistance. Next slide. Again, just reminding you where we are starting with today, and of course, the D1 boundary we are all familiar with. And again, because it is so stable, where it is seeing in most instances the least change of all of the districts because of it being far to the northwest of the city with those fixed boundaries, and the needs of the needs relative to the needs of the 2 districts, 7 and 2, that are immediately adjacent to it. Next slide. So, and the next slide, please. So, option 1, in this case, we look to try to smooth out the streets, the boundaries between districts as much as possible, while still focusing on having, to the greatest extent possible, our populations be as close to 91,403. So this shows you that configuration. We try to, as much as possible, kind of stick with and hold the core of each district the same and just work on those edges and utilize that grid that we're limited to from the voting precincts and try to smooth out those edges, if you will. Next slide shows you specifically.
Remind folks that the perforated, the little
Yes,
broken up
thank
dots.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So as Councilman is indicating, the new boundaries are the solid lines. You can see that the old boundaries, you can begin to see the change as they are indicated in these dashed lines as you see them pop up. And again, you can see how few they are in relative terms, except for maybe District 5 and its borders, and I'll get to the impact of District 5 later. But from map to map, this is how you'll be able to distinguish on these larger citywide maps the proposed boundary from the existing boundary. And then on the next slide, which is specific to D1 under option 1, we further delineate the existing district in the lighter blue to any addition to it that is made and shown in the darker blue, and then anything that is being subtracted is shown in the red. So under option 1, District 1, and this will be true for all of the options, District 1 will gain this area here, which we believe is another one of those results of changes in the precincts. The reason why it was not included beforehand, because it was part of a larger precinct which connected it to the east, which is why it was part of District 2. We're now able, under this configuration, to add that little notch, which is Curtis, Rosemont, Clarita, and Southfield Freeway. That notch in all of these options is added to District 1. Then again, here in option 1, what you're losing in this proposal from District 1 would be the area essentially south of 96 here, south of 96 in Schoolcraft, south of Schoolcraft here, down to Fullerton in both instances, coming back up at Greenfield to Grand River, and over to, I believe, Ardmore. Thank you. Next slide. Moving now to option 2. With option 2, we tried to focus a little bit more in on equal populations, so the lines maybe are not as smooth, but the populations, as you'll note, are all much closer to that 91,400 mark. And here again, you can see the difference between existing boundaries and the proposed boundaries. Next slide. In this option, again, D1 picks up that area just north of Curtis and west of Southfield. Here, we're retaining the area below Schoolcraft, and we are now looking to lose in this one. So here, we've got Hubble. So essentially, McNichols to, I believe it's Ardmore. Yeah, Ardmore, again, down to 96 and Fullerton, and then coming back over to Winthrop, and then north to, I believe, Puritan. Yes. So that is the portion that would be lost in this proposal, and by and large, the remaining proposals have just variations on this theme. Next slide. Option 3 was the first time that we tried to really explore a slightly different approach. Next slide. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this,
The
it's the same for.
right, right. No, but what I wanted to point out was on the main map. Yeah. So on the larger map, what we did here, which this was part of the point I was raising with the option 2 in terms of there being very little change in District 1. Here, however, because of the losses in Districts 4 and 3, we took a different approach with this option, where instead of kind of rotating, if you will, in a clockwise fashion, meaning that where District 3 had losses and District 4 had losses, we would essentially look to District 5 to try to make up those losses. In this one, we're going back the other way, counterclockwise, which means that we pushed all the more into District 2, and you can see how much of District 2 is lost in this option in order to allow for the gains in Districts 3 and District 4 while not impacting District 5 as much. Again, go on to the next slide. Even with this option, D1, as indicated before, still remains somewhat the same, with Districts 5, 6, and 7 really bearing the brunt. Next option. Option 4 was one that we were, options 4 and 5 were the additional options that we were asked to do by City Council about 2.5 weeks ago after them having the opportunity to get some initial reaction to those first ones. Here, we tried to, again, go back to what it looks like if we look at rotating clockwise in order to address the losses in 3 and 4, but still have some impact on District 2, where District 2 loses this area between Woodward and John R. But here we look at what happens, as I was alluding to earlier with District 5. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, by and large, have all these fixed boundaries. There's nothing you can do with them, so all you can do is work with what's internal. District 5 has the smallest of the fixed boundaries, if you will, with Woodward, and then, of course, what you have with Hamtramck and Highland Park. So District 5 almost always sort of is the leftover, if you will. It's the result of what you have once you have dealt with the other 6 districts. So District 5 can push further north, going from the river all the way up into District 2. It can push into 6 as well as to 7. So in this district, in this option, option 4, we tried to maintain as much as we could to the south, but that meant that District 6 pushes more into 7, and 7 then pushes up a little bit more into 1 and 2. Next slide. So here we have, again, a similar configuration, but we change a little bit here further to the north in order to compensate for those differences where the push from 5 impacts 7, 1, and 2. So here we have, again, McNichols, Ardmore, again, back down to Fullerton, coming back up along Winthrop to Finkel in this case, and then coming up, I believe, Sussex to Puritan, and then back out up to McNichols. And our last option, option 5, another variation of the same approach, but where we allowed District 5 to push further north. So here you can see District 5, which stopped at Finkel beforehand, in this instance goes all the way up to Livernois and McNichols, essentially picking up the U of D campus and the neighborhood to the east. So you get a much greater push of District 5 up north into the city, and preserving a little bit more of District 6 as it was previously configured, but you do get a little more impact to 7, and that then results, next slide, into, again, a similar configuration with District 1, but picking up or retaining this area. Again, the area bounded by Grand River, Ardmore, Fullerton, and Greenfield. So these are the 5 options and the resulting options for District 1 that we have presented City Council thus far. Again, as the Council President Pro Tem indicated, these are now out for public consumption so that we can hear from you, so that we can hear from the council members entirely as they and their staff go and look more deeply into this to see the impacts to the districts, and to the extent that it is within the legal requirements, that it is within that grid of the voting precincts, we can make further tweaks to this. And the last thing that I want to say, further emphasizing that point of the population, we endeavored to bring to the council members districts that were, again, as close in population as possible. But we can, as we get to the refinement of these options and the selection of the final one, we can have further disparity in those populations. Again, from from 86,830 to 95,970. Again, what we've tried to do is stay as close to that 91,400, but we can have greater disparity within that 5% range, which could cause for there to be greater retention, if you will, particularly when you look at the more stable districts of 7, 1, and 2, that along with 5 are really the ones that are making up for the losses on the east side of the city. So that's the technical and legal sort of underpinnings of what we've done, and we are happy to receive your thoughts and comments and assist ultimately the City Council in getting to their final determination on the new districts for the 2025 election and forward.